Every November, something strange happens in America. Millions of people travel hundreds of miles to sit in rooms with relatives they avoid the rest of the year. They consume a specific bird, always the same bird, prepared according to traditions no one can quite explain. They watch a parade sponsored by a department store. They watch men give each other brain injuries on a grass field. And then, at midnight, they trample each other at shopping centers to buy discounted televisions. If you described Thanksgiving to someone who had never heard of it, if you explained it objectively without the cultural context, it would sound insane. It would sound like a cargo cult, a ritualized compulsion, a mass observance of something Americans can no longer name or understand. And in a way, it is. Thanksgiving is the most American holiday. It's the one we invented ourselves, the one that belongs to no religion, the one that supposedly commemorates our founding myth. Pilgrims and Indians sitting down together in harmony, sharing food, giving thanks. A story of unity, of cooperation, of gratitude. It's a beautiful story, and almost every part of it is a lie. The people we call pilgrims were not gentle seekers of religious freedom. They were extremists, so rigid, so intolerant, that even other Puritans found them difficult. They didn't flee persecution. They fled a society that was too tolerant for their tastes. The Native Americans who saved them from starvation, the Wampanoag, the people of the so-called First Thanksgiving, would be systematically destroyed within a generation. Their leader's head would be displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. And the holiday itself was not created to commemorate peace or gratitude. It was created in 1863, in the bloodiest year of the bloodiest war in American history, as a tool of propaganda, a way to forge national unity through myth while the nation was literally tearing itself apart. Tonight, we're going to carve Thanksgiving open like a turkey. We're going to pull back the crispy golden skin of mythology and examine what's underneath. And what we'll find is blood, betrayal, genocide, and the systematic construction of a national lie. We'll answer the questions you've probably never thought to ask. Why do we celebrate Thanksgiving in late November specifically? What happened on that date? Who were the Pilgrims really, and why did they come here? What were they running from, and what were they running toward? What actually happened at the first Thanksgiving? Was it even a Thanksgiving? Why turkey? Why cranberries? Why these specific foods? Why did it take 242 years after that famous meal for Thanksgiving to become a national holiday? And what happened to the native people who shared that first feast? Where are they now? None of this is arbitrary. None of it is innocent. Every tradition has a reason. Every symbol has a history. And almost all of those histories have been deliberately obscured, sanitized, or erased. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe that the stories we tell ourselves as a nation deserve to be examined honestly, that the line between myth and history matters, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support allows us to keep excavating the graves we've built our holidays on. Tonight, we will walk through 7 chapters of Thanksgiving's hidden history. We'll go back 400 years to a small group of English extremists crossing a hostile ocean. We'll meet the man who saved them, a Native American named Squanto, whose personal tragedy is more devastating than any fiction. We'll witness the war that followed, a conflict so bloody that proportionally it dwarfs any other in American history. We'll watch as early Thanksgivings were declared not for peace, but for massacre. And we'll see how a single woman's 30-year campaign and a desperate president's need for unity created the holiday we know today. By the end, you'll never look at Thanksgiving the same way. You'll see the graves beneath the table. You'll understand that when you carve a turkey, you're participating in a ritual of forgetting, a collective agreement to not see what we did, to celebrate the prelude to genocide as though it were a friendship. Thanksgiving is not what we think it is. It never was. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. The story we learn in school goes something like this. The Pilgrims were peaceful religious people who were persecuted in England for their beliefs. They fled to America, seeking religious freedom. They were the original Americans, the founders of our tradition of tolerance. This story is not entirely false, but it leaves out the most important parts. The people we call pilgrims didn't call themselves that. The term was applied retroactively in the 19th century to make them sound more sympathetic. They called themselves saints. Everyone else, everyone who wasn't part of their specific religious community, they called strangers. The saints were English separatists, a radical Protestant sect that believed the Church of England was beyond saving. They weren't Puritans exactly. Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England from within, to reform it, to make it holier. The separatists believed this was impossible. The Church of England was too corrupt, too Catholic in its ceremonies and hierarchies, too sinful. The only option was complete separation. This might sound reasonable to modern ears. If you disagree with an institution, leave it. Start your own thing. What's the problem? The problem was that in early 17th century England, the Church of England was the state. The king was the head of the church. To reject the church was to reject the king's authority. It was sedition. It was treason. So yes, the separatists were persecuted. They were fined, imprisoned, watched by authorities. Their meetings were broken up. Their leaders were arrested. Life was difficult. But here's what the mythology leaves out. The separatists were also persecutors. To understand who the Pilgrims really were, you need to understand their theology. And their theology was brutal. They believed in predestination, the Calvinist doctrine that God had already decided, before the creation of the world, who would be saved and who would be damned. Nothing you did in life could change your fate. You were either one of the elect, destined for heaven, or you were damned, destined for hell. And you probably couldn't know for certain which you were. This sounds like it might lead to fatalism. Why try to be good if your fate is already sealed? But in practice, it led to obsessive moralism. The elect, the theory went, would naturally behave in godly ways. If you weren't behaving in godly ways, that was evidence that you weren't elect. So you had to constantly monitor yourself and others, looking for signs of election or damnation. The separatists believed that their tiny community was composed of the elect, the visible saints, gathered together in a pure church. Everyone outside their community was suspect at best, damned at worst. They believed in strict moral codes enforced by the community. Dancing was sinful, theatre was sinful, Christmas celebrations were sinful. They associated Christmas traditions with Catholicism. Anything that brought pleasure without direct religious purpose was suspect. They believed in intolerance as a virtue. Tolerating sin was itself sinful. Tolerating false religion was itself false religion. The godly community had a duty to purge sin from its midst, to maintain purity at all costs. This was not a community that believed in religious freedom as we understand it. They believed in their freedom to practice their religion. Everyone else's freedom was irrelevant or actively dangerous. In 1608, about 12 years before the Mayflower voyage, the separatist congregation fled England for the Netherlands. They settled in Leiden, a university city known for its religious tolerance. The Netherlands in the early 17th century was one of the most tolerant places in Europe. Jews, Catholics, various Protestant sects, all were permitted to worship more or less freely. The Dutch had fought their own war of independence against Catholic Spain and had emerged with a culture that valued religious diversity. The separatists lived in Leiden for about 12 years. They were left alone. They could practice their religion freely. No one was fining them or imprisoning them or breaking up their meetings. And they hated it. They didn't hate the persecution, which had stopped. They hated the tolerance, because tolerance meant their children were exposed to other ways of life. Dutch children played games and celebrated festivals that the separatists considered sinful. Dutch society was vibrant, commercial, diverse, everything the separatists associated with worldliness and corruption. Their children were becoming Dutch, learning Dutch language, adopting Dutch customs, maybe even marrying Dutch people who weren't part of the pure community. The separatist identity was dissolving into the tolerant society around them. William Bradford, who would become governor of Plymouth Colony, later wrote about this period with horror. He described how the children were being drawn into extravagant and dangerous courses by the great licentiousness of youth in the Netherlands. The danger wasn't persecution. The danger was freedom. So they decided to leave. Not because they couldn't practice their religion. They could. But because other people could practice other religions, and their children were noticing. They wanted to go somewhere they could establish their own society with their own rules, where they could raise their children without exposure to alternatives. They wanted isolation. They wanted control. America offered that. It was far away. It was sparsely populated, they thought. They could build a pure community there, separate from the corruption of the old world, where the saints could govern themselves according to God's law. They weren't fleeing persecution. They were fleeing tolerance. They weren't seeking religious freedom for everyone. They were seeking the power to create their own intolerant society. In September 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers. Here's something important that gets left out of the mythology. Only about 40 of those passengers were separatists, the saints, the religious community from Leiden. The rest were what the saints called strangers, ordinary colonists, servants, hired hands, people seeking economic opportunity rather than religious purity. The voyage was sponsored by a group of London merchants who expected to profit from the colony. The religious idealists needed money. The investors needed workers. So the Mayflower carried a mixed group, saints and strangers, believers and mercenaries, ideologues and opportunists. This created tension from the beginning. The saints looked down on the strangers as ungodly. The strangers resented the saints' moral superiority. The two groups had different goals, different values, different reasons for making the voyage. The crossing took 66 days. The conditions were brutal. The Mayflower was a cargo ship, not designed for passengers. People were crammed into the lower deck, in the dark, in the cold, with minimal sanitation. Storms battered the ship. People got sick. One person died during the crossing. They were supposed to land in Virginia, where they had permission to settle, but storms and navigation errors brought them to Cape Cod, in what is now Massachusetts, outside the territory of their patent. They had no legal authority to establish a colony there. This created a crisis. Some of the strangers began talking about striking out on their own once they landed. Why should they follow the saints' leadership if they were outside the legal boundaries of the patent? Why should they submit to a government they hadn't agreed to? The response was the Mayflower Compact, signed on November 11th, 1620, while the ship was still anchored off Cape Cod. The Mayflower Compact is often celebrated as an early example of democracy, of government by consent, of the American political tradition. And in some ways, it was remarkable. A written agreement among colonists to govern themselves, to make and obey laws, to form a civil body politic. But let's be clear about what it was: an emergency measure created because they had landed in the wrong place and needed to maintain order. It was signed only by adult male passengers, 41 out of 102 people. Women, servants, and children had no say. And the government it created was not democratic in any modern sense. It was a religious oligarchy controlled by the saints, where voting rights and political power were limited to church members. The strangers were incorporated into the compact, but they were never equal to the saints. The colony would be governed according to separatist principles, enforcing separatist morality led by separatist leaders. The founders of Plymouth were not creating a democracy. They were creating a theocracy. They landed at the site of Plymouth in late December 1620. This was the worst possible time to start a colony. Winter in New England is harsh. The colonists had no shelter. They had limited food supplies. They had no experience with the land, no knowledge of what was edible, no understanding of how to survive in this environment. They started dying almost immediately. Disease swept through the group, probably a combination of scurvy, pneumonia, and infections made worse by malnutrition and exposure. People weakened and died within days. There was no medicine, no proper shelter, no way to escape the cold. By the end of March 1621, about half the colonists were dead. Of the 102 passengers who had crossed on the Mayflower, approximately 50 survived the first winter. Whole families were wiped out. At some points, only a handful of people were healthy enough to care for the sick. William Bradford described the scene in his journal. In the time of most distress, there was but 6 or 7 sound persons, who, to their great commendations be it spoken, spared no pains, night nor day, but with abundance of toil and hazard of their own health, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them. The survivors were starving, freezing, desperate. They were weeks away from complete extinction. And here's something the Thanksgiving mythology doesn't mention. During this period, the colonists raided Native American food stores. They found a native village that appeared to be abandoned. They found underground storage pits filled with corn. They took the corn. They found graves and disturbed them, taking burial goods. They explored the area, taking whatever they could find that might help them survive. This was theft. The people whose corn they took, whose graves they disturbed, would later return and find their stores raided. The colonists' survival that first winter was built partly on stealing from native people. But theft alone wouldn't be enough. They needed more. They needed knowledge of the land, of how to farm it, of how to survive here. And then, on March 16th, 1621. A native man walked into their settlement. He walked straight up to the astonished colonists. He was nearly naked, wearing only a leather fringe around his waist, and he spoke to them in English. "Welcome, Englishmen," he said. His name was Samoset, and the story he would tell them and the man he would introduce them to would change everything. But the man who would truly save the Pilgrims, a man named Squanto, known to history as Squanto, had a story of his own. A story of kidnapping, slavery, plague, and a tragedy so complete that helping the English might have been the only thing he had left. Samoset was not from the local area. He was an Abenaki Sagamore from what is now Maine, visiting the Wampanoag territory. He had learned some English from fishermen who worked the coastal waters. But Samoset's English was limited. He could greet the colonists, could communicate basic ideas, but he couldn't serve as a real translator or cultural bridge. He told them, however, that he knew someone who could, someone whose English was fluent, someone who had actually been to England, someone who knew the colonists' language and culture intimately. A few days later, Samoset returned with this man. His name was Squanto, though the colonists would call him Squanto. And Squanto's existence was impossible. How could there be a Native American in this remote wilderness who spoke perfect English, who had been to London, who understood European customs? The answer to that question is one of the most tragic stories in American history. Squanto was born around 1585, a member of the Patuxet Band of the Wampanoag Confederacy. The Patuxet lived in the area where Plymouth would later be established, the very land the colonists had chosen for their settlement. In 1614, 6 years before the Mayflower arrived, an English explorer named Thomas Hunt came to the coast of New England. Hunt was part of an expedition led by Captain John Smith, the same John Smith of Pocahontas fame, mapping the coastline and assessing opportunities for colonization. Hunt was left behind to finish some trading while Smith returned to England. And Hunt saw an opportunity for profit. He lured about 20 native people onto his ship, including Squanto. Then he seized them, chained them, and sailed for Spain, where he intended to sell them as slaves. This was kidnapping. This was human trafficking. This was a crime even by the standards of the time. The English authorities were outraged when they found out, not because they cared about native rights, but because Hunt's actions would make it harder to establish peaceful trading relationships with native peoples. Hunt brought his captives to Malaga, Spain, and began selling them. But local Catholic friars intervened, taking some of the captives under their protection. Whether they freed them, converted them, or simply transferred ownership is unclear. The historical record is spotty. What we know is that Squanto somehow escaped slavery. He made his way to England, where he lived for several years, learning the language and customs of the English. He may have worked as a servant in a wealthy household. He learned to navigate English society, to speak the language fluently, to understand how these people thought and lived, and he wanted to go home. In 1619, Squanto finally managed to secure passage back to New England. After 5 years in captivity, after crossing the ocean to slavery and back again, after learning the language and ways of his captors, he was going home. He arrived on the coast of New England and made his way to his village, to his people, to the Patuxet. They were gone. Not just gone, dead. All of them. Every single person he had known. Every family member, every friend, every person he had grown up with. Dead. Between 1616 and 1619, while Squanto was in England, a catastrophic epidemic had swept through the coastal native populations of New England. Modern researchers believe it was likely leptospirosis, or possibly viral hepatitis, brought by European traders and fishermen. The disease killed with terrifying efficiency. Mortality rates in some areas reached 90%. Entire villages were wiped out. The Patuxet, Squanto's people, were completely destroyed. Every single one of them died. Squanto was the last Patuxet, the sole survivor of his entire people. Not because he was stronger or luckier, but because he hadn't been there. He had been enslaved in Spain, then living in England, while everyone he loved died of a disease his captors' countrymen had brought. He found skeletons. He found abandoned villages. He found the bones of his family. William Bradford would later write that the colonists found skulls and bones were found in many places lying still above ground, where their houses and dwellings had been, a very sad spectacle to behold. Bradford was describing the aftermath of the epidemic. He was describing the mass grave of Squanto's people, and the colonists built their settlement on top of it. The Pilgrims saw the cleared land, the empty villages, the agricultural fields already prepared for planting, and they saw the hand of God. Seriously, they believed that God had cleared the land for them, that God had killed the native inhabitants so that his chosen people could take their place. John Winthrop, who would lead the later Massachusetts Bay Colony, wrote, "God hath hereby cleared our title to this place. If God were not pleased with our inheriting these parts, why did he drive out the natives before us? And why does he still make room for us by diminishing them as we increase?" The epidemic that killed Squanto's people was, to the colonists, divine real estate management. They settled in the fields the Patuxet had cleared. They used the agricultural infrastructure the Patuxet had built. They lived because the Patuxet had died. And now, the last survivor of the Patuxet was standing in front of them, speaking perfect English, offering to help them survive on the land where his people had died. Squanto had been taken in by Massacre, the Sachem leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. But Massacre had his own reasons for wanting to help the English, and they had nothing to do with friendship. The epidemic had devastated the Wampanoag. Their population had been reduced by perhaps 75%. Entire villages were gone. Their military strength was a fraction of what it had been. Meanwhile, the Narragansett, a rival confederacy to the west, had been less affected by the plague. They now outnumbered the Wampanoag. They were threatening. They were demanding tribute. Massasoit was facing a strategic crisis. His people were weak. Their enemies were strong. He needed allies. Allies with new kinds of power, new kinds of weapons, new kinds of leverage. The English had guns. They had metal tools. They had diseases that didn't kill them, but devastated their enemies. An alliance with the English could tip the balance of power back in the Wampanoag's favor. So Massasoit made a calculated decision. He would help these strange, sickly, incompetent foreigners survive. He would send Squanto, who spoke their language, who understood their ways, to teach them how to live on this land. It was politics, not friendship. It was alliance, not affection. The Wampanoag helped the English because the Wampanoag needed the English, and for a while it worked. In March 1621, Squanto came to live with the colonists. He stayed with them for the next year and a half until his death in November 1622, and he saved their lives. Without exaggeration, without mythology, He saved their lives. He taught them how to plant corn, the crop that would become their staple food. The technique was Native American. You plant corn, beans, and squash together, burying a small fish with the seeds to fertilize the soil. The three sisters, as native peoples called them, the three crops that sustain life. He showed them where to fish, what rivers and coastal areas would be most productive. He taught them where to hunt, which animals were plentiful, which areas were most promising. He taught them which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were dangerous. He shared the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of human habitation on this land. And he served as translator and diplomat, facilitating communication between the colonists and Massasoit, helping to establish the treaty that would keep peace between the two groups for decades. Without Tisquantum, the colonists would have died. This is not speculation. They were dying before he came. They had no idea how to survive in this environment. The skills he taught them, corn planting, fishing, hunting, were essential to their survival. But why did he do it? We don't know. We can never know for certain what was in Tisquantum's heart. Maybe he genuinely liked the colonists. Maybe he saw them as fellow survivors in a hostile world. Maybe he was lonely, the last of his people, with no community of his own, finding a new community to belong to. Maybe he was playing his own political game, using his unique position as translator to accumulate power and influence. Maybe he hated the other native groups who had failed to protect his people, or who had wronged him in some way we don't know about, and helping their competitors was a form of revenge. Or maybe he simply had nowhere else to go. His people were dead. He had no home to return to. The colonists needed him. Being needed might have been enough. Whatever his reasons, he taught them to survive. And in the fall of 1621, when the harvest came in, when the corn and beans and squash grew as he had taught them, the colonists had enough food to live. They decided to celebrate. In the fall of 1621, probably late September or October, not late November, the colonists held a harvest celebration. Note what I didn't say. I didn't say the first Thanksgiving, because the colonists didn't call it that. There's no evidence they considered it a Thanksgiving at all, in the religious sense. In Puritan tradition, a Thanksgiving was a specific religious observance, a day of prayer and fasting to thank God for a particular blessing. It was solemn, prayerful, focused on divine gratitude. What happened in 1621 was not that. It was a harvest feast, a secular celebration of the successful harvest, similar to harvest festivals in England and throughout Europe. It was a party, not a prayer meeting. The only first-hand account we have comes from Edward Winslow, who wrote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labours. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others." That's it. That's the only contemporary description of the first Thanksgiving. Notice what's there and what isn't. There were about 50 colonists, the survivors of the first winter, and about 90 Wampanoag. The native people significantly outnumbered the colonists. They ate for 3 days. This was a substantial event, not a single meal. They ate fowl, probably ducks and geese, maybe wild turkeys, but we don't know for sure. The Wampanoag brought 5 deer. Venison was a major part of the feast. They exercised their arms, meaning they fired guns, probably as demonstrations or competitions. This was partly celebration, partly a display of English military power. There's no mention of turkey as the main dish, no cranberry sauce, no pumpkin pie, no particular religious prayers or Thanksgiving ceremonies. And there's an important question: why did the Wampanoag come? Some historians believe they weren't actually invited. They may have heard the colonists firing their guns and come to investigate, concerned about potential military action. The feast may have been a tense diplomatic encounter that both sides decided to make the best of. Or maybe they were invited as part of the ongoing alliance. Maybe Massasoit wanted to reinforce the relationship, to remind the colonists of Wampanoag power and importance. Either way, this was not a sentimental gathering of friends. It was a political event between two groups who needed each other for different reasons. The colonists needed Wampanoag knowledge and protection. The Wampanoag needed English weapons and alliance against the Narragansett. It was a peace summit. It was a military alliance. It was a business meeting. It was not a Thanksgiving. And within 55 years, the descendants of the men who sat at that feast would be at war. A war that would kill a higher percentage of the population than any other war in American history. A war that would end with the Wampanoag destroyed and their leader's head on a pike. But before we get to King Philip's War, we need to understand what happened in the decades between, how the relationship deteriorated, how the alliance became subjugation, how the people who had saved the colonists became obstacles to be removed. The peace that Massasoit established with the Plymouth colonists lasted for his lifetime. For approximately 40 years, from 1621 to 1661, the alliance held. But during those 40 years, everything changed. When the Pilgrims landed in 1620, there were about 100 of them, huddled in a single struggling settlement, dependent on native knowledge and goodwill for survival. By the time Massasoit died in 1661, the English population of New England had grown to approximately 33,000 people. More colonists arrived every year, not just to Plymouth, but to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to Connecticut, to Rhode Island. The English were spreading across the landscape like a wave, and the native population was shrinking. More epidemics swept through. Wars with colonists took their toll. By 1670, the Wampanoag and other native peoples of southern New England numbered perhaps 10,000 to 15,000, a fraction of their pre-contact population. The balance of power had completely reversed. Where once the native peoples had been the dominant force, with the colonists as their dependent allies, now the colonists were the dominant power, and the native peoples were the ones scrambling to survive. Massasoit's calculation, that alliance with the English would protect the Wampanoag, was proving disastrously wrong. The English demanded land, constantly, endlessly. Every year they wanted more. Sometimes they bought it, or claimed to buy it, in transactions that native peoples often didn't understand. The English concept of private property, of permanent exclusive ownership of land, was foreign to native cultures. You might agree to let the English use a piece of land, not understanding that you were signing away all rights to it forever. Sometimes the English simply took land. They would mark boundaries, build fences, claim ownership, and if native people objected, the English courts would rule in favor of English claims. English livestock made the problem worse. The colonists let their pigs and cattle roam freely, and these animals would wander into native fields, destroying crops. When native people killed the animals destroying their food, the English would demand compensation. When native people refused, the English would take land as payment. It was a rigged game. Every interaction led to native people losing more. And then there was the matter of law. The English began applying English law to native people. Native individuals could be arrested by English constables, tried in English courts, punished according to English statutes. The laws were not their laws. The courts were not their courts. The judges were not their judges. But the punishments were real. Native people were fined for violations they didn't understand. They were imprisoned for crimes the English had defined. They were executed for offences that wouldn't have been offences under their own legal systems. The alliance Massasoit had built had become subjugation. The Wampanoag were no longer partners. They were subjects. Subjects of a foreign power that was systematically taking everything they had. Massasoit died in 1661. His eldest son, Wamsuta, whom the English called Alexander, became Sachem. Within a year, Wamsuta was dead. He had been summoned to Plymouth to answer questions about rumoured plots against the colonists. Shortly after returning from this meeting, he fell ill and died. Many Wampanoag believed he had been poisoned. Wamsuta's younger brother became Sachem. His name was Metacom. The English called him King Philip, a mocking title implying pretensions to royalty that the English found amusing. Metacom was probably in his early 20s when he became leader. He had watched his father's alliance fail to protect his people. He may have watched his brother be murdered. He watched the English take more and more, saw his people's power dwindling, saw the future closing in. For 14 years, from 1661 to 1675, Metacom tried to navigate the impossible situation. He negotiated with the colonists. He agreed to treaties. He tried to maintain what remained of Wampanoag autonomy while avoiding the war he knew would be devastating. But the situation kept getting worse. More land lost, more English settlers, more laws applied to his people, more indignities, and then came the final insult. In January 1675, a man named John Sassamon was found dead beneath the ice of Assawampset Pond. His neck was broken. Sassamon was a complex figure. He was a native man who had converted to Christianity, been educated at Harvard, and served as an advisor and translator for Metacom. But shortly before his death, he had gone to Plymouth and warned the English that Metacom was planning an uprising. Whether Sassamon's warning was accurate, whether Metacom was actually planning war at that point, we don't know. But the English believed it. And when Sassamon turned up dead, they believed he had been murdered to silence him. 3 Wampanoag men were accused of the murder. They were tried in a Plymouth court, an English court, with English judges, English law, and a mostly English jury. All 3 were convicted and hanged in June 1675. This was unprecedented. English courts had never before tried native people for a crime committed against another native person. It was a violation of the agreements that had governed relations between the 2 peoples. It was the English asserting total legal authority over the Wampanoag, even in internal matters. One of the executed men was a counselor to Metacom. Within weeks, the war began. King Philip's War, as the English called it, lasted from June 1675 to August 1676, just over a year. It was the bloodiest conflict in American history, proportionally speaking. Let me put that in perspective. Approximately 600 to 800 English colonists were killed, about 2.5% of the English population of New England. If the same proportion of Americans were killed in a war today, it would be about 8 million people. The native death toll was far higher. At least 3,000 Native Americans were killed in combat or massacres, and probably many more. Thousands more were sold into slavery, deported, or died of starvation and exposure as refugees. When the war ended, the native population of southern New England had been reduced by perhaps 80%. Entire peoples were destroyed. Those who survived were scattered, subjugated, stripped of power forever. The fighting was brutal on both sides. There were massacres, torture, mutilation. English prisoners were sometimes killed slowly. Native prisoners, including women and children, were executed or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. About half of all English towns in New England were attacked. 12 towns were completely destroyed, burned to the ground, their inhabitants killed or fled. The war reached almost to the gates of Boston. For months, it looked like the English might actually lose, might be driven back into the sea. But the English had advantages the native peoples couldn't overcome. More guns, more ammunition, the ability to call for reinforcements from England and other colonies. And crucially, native allies. Some native groups fought alongside the English, either from old rivalries with Metacom's alliance or from a calculation that the English would win, and it was better to be on the winning side. By the summer of 1676, Metacom's alliance was collapsing. His forces were scattered. His allies were surrendering or being hunted down. He had lost his wife and son. They had been captured and would be sold into slavery. On August 12, 1676, an English force guided by native informers found Metacom hiding in a swamp near Mount Hope, his ancestral home. He was shot by a native man named John Alderman, who was fighting for the English. Metacom's body was drawn and quartered, cut into 4 pieces, the traditional English punishment for traitors. His head was severed and carried to Plymouth. There, it was mounted on a wooden pole and displayed publicly. Metacom's head remained on that pole in Plymouth for 25 years, a quarter century. Visitors to Plymouth could see it, rotting and weathering, a monument to English victory and native defeat. This was the same Plymouth where, 55 years earlier, Massasoit had come in peace, where the first Thanksgiving had been celebrated, where the alliance had been formed that saved the colonists' lives. Now Massasoit's son's head was rotting on a stake in the town square. Metacom's wife and 9-year-old son were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. They were not unique. Thousands of native captives were sold into slavery after the war, sent to the West Indies, to Bermuda, to the Azores. They were never seen again. The Wampanoag Confederacy was destroyed. The people who had saved the Pilgrims, who had taught them to survive, who had fed them at that famous harvest feast, they were either dead, enslaved, or scattered. Native autonomy in southern New England was over. Those native peoples who remained were subjected to English law, confined to small reservations, stripped of power and self-governance. The land was now fully English. The obstacle had been removed. And here's the thing, this happened. This is documented history. This is not interpretation or speculation. Metacom's head was displayed in Plymouth Native people were sold into slavery. The war killed a higher proportion of the population than any other American war. But we don't learn it. It's barely mentioned in most American history education. The first Thanksgiving story requires this war to be invisible. We can't celebrate the feast while acknowledging the genocide that followed, so we forget. We keep the heartwarming story and erase the horrifying sequel. The Thanksgiving mythology requires us to see 1621 without seeing 1676. It requires us to celebrate the meal without acknowledging that the guests would soon be destroying each other. It requires a selective amnesia that protects our comforting story from the devastating truth. In colonial New England, Thanksgiving was not a holiday. It was a practice. Days of Thanksgiving were declared by colonial governors or ministers in response to specific events. A good harvest, victory in battle, the end of a drought, recovery from an epidemic. When something good happened, especially something attributed to divine favor, the authorities would proclaim a day of thanksgiving to acknowledge God's blessing. These were religious observances, days of prayer, sermons, public worship. They were not fixed to any particular date. They were not annual. They happened when the authorities decided they should happen, in response to specific occasions. There were also days of fasting and humiliation, which were the opposite. When something bad happened, a drought, a military defeat, an epidemic, the authorities would proclaim a day for the community to fast, pray, and humble themselves before God, seeking forgiveness for whatever sins had provoked divine displeasure. This system continued for over 150 years. Thanksgiving days came and went, declared for various reasons, observed and forgotten. And many of those reasons were military victories, specifically military victories over native peoples. In 1637, 40 years before King Philip's War, colonial New England experienced its first major war with native peoples, the Pequot War. The Pequot were a powerful confederacy in what is now Connecticut. Tensions with English colonists escalated through the 1630s. Disputes over trade, over land, over murders on both sides that demanded revenge. In May 1637, a combined force of English colonists from Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay, along with Mohegan and Narragansett allies, attacked the main Pequot village at Mystic. The village was surrounded while most of its inhabitants slept. The English set fire to the wigwams. As the Pequot tried to escape the flames, they were shot or cut down. Those who stayed inside burned. Between 400 and 700 Pequot were killed, most of them women, children, and elderly. The majority of Pequot warriors were away from the village at the time. This was a massacre of non-combatants. Captain John Mason, who led the attack, wrote, "Thus did the Lord judge among the heathen, filling the place with dead bodies." Captain John Underhill, who was also present, wrote, "Great and doleful was the bloody sight to the view of young soldiers that never had been in war, to see so many souls lie gasping on the ground, so thick in some places that you could hardly pass along. Even some of the English allies were disturbed. The Narragansett, who had helped surround the village, reportedly said the English way of war was too savage, that it slew too many men." And what did the Massachusetts Bay Colony do in response to this massacre? They declared a day of thanksgiving. William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth, wrote, "It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. A sweet sacrifice. Thanks given to God for burning hundreds of women and children alive. This was what early Thanksgivings often were: celebrations of victory over native peoples, acknowledgements of divine favor in war, thanks given to God for helping English colonists kill their enemies. The Pequot Massacre was not unique. Throughout the colonial period, Thanksgiving days were declared for military victories, and those victories were often over native peoples. When King Philip's War ended in 1676, the Connecticut General Assembly declared a day of public thanksgiving. They gave thanks to God for delivering them from their enemies, for the victory that had destroyed the Wampanoag, for the death of Metacom. The pattern was consistent. Native people attacked or resisted. English colonists fought back, often with devastating violence. English colonists won. English colonists gave thanks to God for helping them win. God was on their side. Their victories proved it. The deaths of native peoples were evidence of divine favor. This theology ran deep. The colonists genuinely believed they were God's chosen people, that America was their promised land, that the native inhabitants were obstacles placed in their path by providence, obstacles that providence would also remove. Every military victory confirmed this. Every Thanksgiving Day reinforced it. They were grateful for dead enemies. They praised God for massacres. This is the tradition that Thanksgiving descends from. Not a single peaceful meal in 1621, but a long history of giving thanks for violence against native peoples. The Continental Congress declared national Thanksgivings during the Revolutionary War, days of prayer and gratitude for military victories, for divine assistance in the struggle for independence. After the Constitution was ratified, George Washington declared a National Day of Thanksgiving on November 26, 1789. This was the first presidential Thanksgiving proclamation. Washington called on Americans to thank God for the new government, for the Constitution, for the blessings of liberty. But this was not an annual holiday. It was a single day declared for a specific occasion. Washington declared one more Thanksgiving Day during his presidency in 1795, after the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion. After Washington, Thanksgiving proclamations became irregular. Some presidents declared them, others didn't. Thomas Jefferson refused to issue any religious proclamations, believing it violated the separation of church and state. James Madison declared some Thanksgiving days during the War of 1812. But there was no consistent national Thanksgiving holiday. For most of American history, Thanksgiving was a regional tradition, celebrated mainly in New England, irregularly, on different dates, in different places. The national holiday we know today didn't exist. It would take 242 years after the Plymouth Harvest Feast for Thanksgiving to become a fixed, annual, national holiday. And when it finally happened, it was created not to celebrate peace, but to forge unity during war. The story of how Thanksgiving became a national holiday is the story of one woman's obsession and one president's desperation. It's a story of mythology manufactured for political purposes. And it's a story that began long before Abraham Lincoln signed the proclamation. It began with a magazine editor who wanted to teach Americans how to be American. Sarah Josepha Hale was one of the most influential women in 19th century America though she's largely forgotten today. She was the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, the most widely circulated magazine in the country before the Civil War. At its peak, it reached 150,000 subscribers, in an era when that represented an enormous percentage of literate American households. Hale used her platform to shape American culture. She promoted women's education. She advocated for professional opportunities for women. She popularized fashion trends and domestic practices. And she wrote prolifically, including poetry, novels, and editorials. She also wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. Yes, that one. Sarah Josepha Hale shaped American childhood culture as well as adult culture. But her greatest crusade, the cause she pursued for 36 years, was the establishment of a national Thanksgiving holiday. Hale believed that America needed unifying national traditions. The country was young, divided by region, by religion, by politics. She saw a national Thanksgiving holiday as a way to create shared American identity, a day when all Americans, regardless of their differences, would come together in gratitude. She wrote editorials promoting the idea. She published recipes for traditional Thanksgiving foods: turkey, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, standardizing what had been regional variations into a national menu. She published stories idealizing Thanksgiving celebrations. And she wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to governors, to congressmen, to presidents. Starting in 1846, she wrote to every president from Zachary Taylor to Abraham Lincoln, urging them to establish a national Thanksgiving holiday. For 17 years, they all said no. In 1863, Sarah Josepha Hale wrote another letter to a president. But this time, circumstances were different. The country was 2 years into the Civil War. The bloodiest war in American history was tearing the nation apart, literally, physically, state by state. 1863 was particularly brutal. The Battle of Gettysburg, in July, had killed approximately 50,000 men in 3 days. The siege of Vicksburg was grinding on. Fighting continued across the South. Abraham Lincoln was desperate for anything that might help unify the North, that might remind Americans of their shared identity, that might strengthen national resolve. Hale's letter arrived at exactly the right moment. She argued that a national Thanksgiving could heal divisions, could remind Americans of their blessings even in dark times, could create a shared ritual of gratitude. On October 3rd, 1863, Lincoln issued a proclamation establishing the last Thursday of November as a national day of Thanksgiving. The proclamation was written by Secretary of State William Seward, but it reflected Hale's vision. It called on Americans to thank God for the blessings of the year, the harvest, the nation's continuing prosperity despite the war, and to pray for healing. Notably, the proclamation said nothing about Pilgrims, nothing about Plymouth, nothing about Native Americans. It was about the Civil War, about national unity, about binding up the nation's wounds. The first Thanksgiving story was not yet central to the holiday. That would come later. After the Civil War, the Thanksgiving holiday continued. Each year, the president would issue a proclamation. Each year, Americans would gather for the holiday that was becoming traditional. And gradually, the mythology developed. The first Thanksgiving story, the Pilgrims and Indians sitting down together in peace, became increasingly central to how Americans understood the holiday. Textbooks told the story. artists painted idealized scenes. The narrative of founding, of survival, of cooperation became the official origin story. This mythology served a purpose. In the post-Civil War era, the country was trying to reconstruct itself. It needed founding myths that emphasized unity, that showed different peoples coming together, that presented American origins as peaceful and cooperative. The Thanksgiving myth offered that. It told Americans that their country was founded in friendship, in sharing, in mutual gratitude. It was a comforting story for a nation that had just spent 4 years killing itself. But the myth required forgetting. Forgetting King Philip's War, forgetting the Pequot Massacre, forgetting the centuries of violence against native peoples that continued even as the myth was being constructed. In the 1870s and 1880s, while Americans celebrated the peaceful Thanksgiving myth, the US Army was conducting campaigns against Plains Indians. The same government that proclaimed National Thanksgiving was also conducting policies of extermination and forced removal against native peoples. The mythology and the reality existed simultaneously. Americans could celebrate peaceful cooperation with Indians at Thanksgiving while reading newspaper accounts of the Indian Wars in the West. The cognitive dissonance required was enormous, but Americans managed it. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Thanksgiving traditions standardized. Turkey became the definitive main dish, not because there was strong evidence of turkey at the 1621 feast, but because turkey was practical. It fed large groups. Economical, turkeys were widely available. And American, they were native to North America. Cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, stuffing, mashed potatoes. These became the expected accompaniments. Magazines like Godey's Lady's Book had promoted these foods for decades, and they gradually became mandatory. The Pilgrims themselves were standardized. The buckle hats, the black clothing, the stern faces. These images were largely 19th century inventions, based more on Victorian ideas of Puritanism than on historical evidence. Actual pilgrims wore colorful clothing and didn't have buckles on their hats, but the standardized image was more useful for the myth. The Indians were standardized too, usually depicted in Plains Indian regalia, feathered headdresses, buckskin. Even though the Wampanoag didn't dress that way, the generic Indian image was easier than historically accurate Wampanoag representations. School plays, holiday pageants, textbook illustrations, all reinforced the standard story. Children learned to dress as pilgrims and Indians, to reenact the peaceful meal, to internalize the founding myth. By the 20th century, the myth was so entrenched that it seemed like ancient tradition. Most Americans had no idea that it was a 19th century construction, that the first Thanksgiving story had been deliberately created to serve political purposes. We had successfully manufactured a founding myth. We had created a tradition of gratitude built on a foundation of forgetting, and every year, millions of Americans would sit down to give thanks for a peaceful history that never happened, while the descendants of the people who actually lived that history watched in silence. We don't know if there was turkey at the 1621 harvest feast. Edward Winslow's account, the only first-hand description, mentions fowl. That's it. Just fowl. Wild turkeys were abundant in the area, so it's possible turkey was eaten. But ducks, geese, and other waterfowl were easier to hunt and may have been more plentiful. Venison, we know, was definitely served. The Wampanoag brought 5 deer. But the turkey that has become synonymous with Thanksgiving may not have been present at all. So how did turkey become the mandatory Thanksgiving food? Partly Practicality. Turkeys are large. A single bird can feed an extended family. By the 19th century, when Thanksgiving was becoming standardized as a family gathering holiday, turkey was a logical choice. It was the meal that said celebration, that said abundance. Partly nationalism. Turkeys are native to North America. They were uniquely American birds. In a holiday that celebrated American founding, an American bird seemed appropriate, and partly promotion. Sarah Josepha Hale and others actively promoted turkey as the Thanksgiving food through magazines, cookbooks, and recipes. The tradition was deliberately constructed. By the 20th century, the association was complete. Thanksgiving without turkey was almost unthinkable. Wild turkeys are impressive animals. They're intelligent, fast, capable of flying. They can run at speeds up to 25 miles per hour. They roost in trees at night. They form complex social groups. Benjamin Franklin famously suggested the turkey as a national symbol, calling it a bird of courage. Domestic turkeys, the kind raised for Thanksgiving, are a different species altogether. Over centuries of selective breeding, we have transformed them into something the wild turkey wouldn't recognize. Modern commercial turkeys have been bred for one thing: breast meat. Americans prefer white meat, so we've engineered birds with grotesquely enlarged breasts. These birds are so top-heavy that many can barely walk. They cannot fly. They cannot run. They cannot mate naturally. Their bodies are too distorted for it. So commercial turkeys are bred through artificial insemination. They are, in a very real sense, biological machines designed to produce meat. They live short lives. A wild turkey can live 3 to 5 years. A commercial turkey is typically slaughtered at 14 to 18 weeks. They never experience adulthood. They never reproduce. They exist only to be eaten. Approximately 46 million turkeys are killed for Thanksgiving in the United States every year. 46 million in a single week, leading up to a single holiday. These birds are raised in industrial facilities, crowded, often windowless buildings, where thousands of birds are packed together. They're bred to grow so fast that their legs often can't support their weight. They develop respiratory problems from ammonia build-up in the crowded conditions. They're debeaked to prevent them from pecking each other in the stress of confinement. This isn't anti-meat propaganda. This is just the reality of industrial poultry production. The conditions have been documented extensively. Industry groups don't really dispute them. They argue that the practices are economically necessary. And maybe they are. Maybe there's no way to raise 46 million turkeys for a single holiday without industrial-scale production. Maybe the demand we've created can only be met through factory farming. But we should at least acknowledge what our holiday requires. 46 million animals, bred into biological distortion, living short lives in industrial conditions, killed so that we can perform our ritual of gratitude. Since 1989, the President of the United States has pardoned a turkey on the White House lawn each year. The ceremony is treated as light-hearted fun. The President makes jokes. The turkey, bewildered, stands on a table. The cameras flash. The pardoned turkey is sent to a farm or sanctuary. One turkey is saved. 46 million are killed. What does this ritual mean? What are we doing when we perform symbolic mercy toward one animal while participating in the mass killing of its species? I don't have a simple answer, but I think the ritual reveals something about our relationship with what we eat. We're uncomfortable. We know at some level that killing 46 million animals for a single holiday might be much. So we perform mercy. We save one, we make a joke of it, and then we proceed with the killing. The pardon doesn't redeem anything. It just demonstrates that we're aware something might need redeeming. Most Americans will never see a living turkey, except maybe a wild one in the distance. The bird that arrives in our kitchens is plastic-wrapped, headless, gutless, unrecognizable as an animal. We've made the killing invisible. We've industrialized death and hidden it from ourselves. This isn't unique to turkeys. It's true of most of the meat we eat. But Thanksgiving, with its focus on a specific animal, makes it particularly stark. We all know we're eating turkey. We just don't think about what that means. The Pilgrims who hunted wild fowl at that first harvest feast knew what they were eating. They had killed it themselves or watched it be killed. The blood was real. The death was immediate. We've removed ourselves from that reality. We've turned death into product, blood into plastic-wrapped commodity. I'm not telling you to stop eating turkey. That's your choice. But I am suggesting that a holiday about gratitude might benefit from a moment of honesty about what our feast costs, about the lives, 46 million lives, that end so we can give thanks. Because gratitude without honesty is just performance. And we've turned Thanksgiving into an elaborate performance of myth, of tradition, of gratitude, while hiding from ourselves what we're actually doing. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade began in 1924. It wasn't called that at first. It was called the Macy's Christmas Parade. The name tells you everything about its purpose. This wasn't about Thanksgiving. It was about Christmas shopping. The parade was designed to kick off the Christmas shopping season, to bring crowds to Herald Square, to get people in a buying mood. A department store created one of America's most beloved Thanksgiving traditions, not as a celebration of gratitude, as advertising. Today, over 3.5 million people watch the parade in person. Tens of millions more watch on television. Giant inflatable cartoon characters float down the streets of Manhattan. Celebrities wave, bands march, and at the end, Santa Claus appears. The message is clear. Thanksgiving is over. Christmas shopping begins. We watch a 3-hour advertisement and call it tradition. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a day of rest, of reflection, of gratitude, a pause. Now it's the starting gun for the most frantic shopping period of the year. Many families rush through the Thanksgiving meal to get to stores that open on Thursday evening. People leave their families at the table to stand in line at Best Buy. The meal that's supposed to be about togetherness becomes an obstacle to shopping. Retail workers report to work on Thanksgiving, unable to spend the holiday with their families. The holiday about gratitude has become a workday for millions of people. The transformation has been gradual but thorough. What was once a day to pause and appreciate what you have has become a day to prepare to acquire more. Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, is the unofficial beginning of the Christmas shopping season. It's called Black Friday because supposedly it's when retailers go into the black, into profitability for the year. It's the biggest shopping day of the year. Retailers offer dramatic discounts. People line up for hours, sometimes days, to get limited doorbuster deals. And every year, people get hurt. There have been deaths at Black Friday sales. People trampled by crowds rushing for discounted televisions. Shootings in parking lot disputes. Fights breaking out in store aisles over limited merchandise. In 2008, a Walmart employee was trampled to death when the doors opened and 2,000 shoppers rushed into the store. He was 34 years old. He died so people could buy discounted electronics. This is not an exaggeration. This is documented. People have literally died in pursuit of Black Friday deals. The pattern is predictable. Crowds, frenzy, competition for limited goods, violence. Every year, security experts warn about the dangers. Every year, the sales continue. Every year, people get hurt. Thanksgiving and Black Friday, taken together, form a bizarre ritual of inversion. On Thursday, we give thanks for what we have. We express gratitude. We, supposedly, pause to appreciate our blessings. On Friday, we rush out to acquire more. We stand in lines. We fight for bargains. We demonstrate through our behavior that what we have is not enough. The gap between the stated meaning and the actual practice could not be wider. We say gratitude. We mean consumption. The turkey is still warm when we start shopping. Maybe this is what we really believe. Maybe the ritual reveals our true values. On Thanksgiving, we say the things we're supposed to say. On Black Friday, we do the things we actually want to do. Gratitude is a performance. Acquisition is the reality. Is there anything left of what Thanksgiving was supposed to be? Yes, some things. Families still gather. That's real. The nuclear family has fractured in many ways, but Thanksgiving still brings people together. More people travel for Thanksgiving than for any other holiday. Families who barely see each other the rest of the year make the effort to share this meal. Some people do pause to express genuine gratitude. The ritual of going around the table, saying what you're thankful for, it can be awkward, it can be performative, but sometimes it's real. Sometimes people actually mean it. Food is shared. In a country where food insecurity is real, Thanksgiving prompts some of the largest food donations of the year. Community meals for those who have nowhere to go. Food drives, charitable giving. So yes, something remains. Under all the mythology and commercialism, some genuine human connection, some real gratitude, some authentic generosity. But we've also hollowed it out. We've wrapped genuine human needs for connection, for gratitude, for community, in packaging that serves other purposes. Commercial purposes, mythological purposes, purposes that have nothing to do with what we actually need. Thanksgiving has become a paradox, a holiday about gratitude that fuels consumption, a celebration of a peaceful past that never existed, a gathering of families that often brings as much stress as joy. We've kept the form and lost the substance, and every year we do it again. The Wampanoag nation still exists. This is worth pausing on. The mythology treats native peoples as historical figures, as if they existed only in the past, as if they played their role in the founding story and then disappeared. But the Wampanoag didn't disappear. They were devastated by war, by disease, by colonization, but they survived. They're still here. Today, there are two federally recognized Wampanoag tribes in Massachusetts, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, Aquinnah. Thousands of Wampanoag people live in Massachusetts and beyond. They're not historical relics. They're living people. They have jobs and families and opinions. They watch Americans celebrate Thanksgiving. They know what the mythology erases. Since 1970, Native Americans have gathered in Plymouth, Massachusetts on Thanksgiving Day. not to celebrate, to mourn. The National Day of Mourning was established in 1970 by Wamsuta Frank James, a Wampanoag leader. He had been invited to speak at a ceremony commemorating the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival. When the organizers saw his prepared remarks, which told the true history of what had happened to native peoples, they rescinded the invitation. So, he organized an alternative gathering. On Thanksgiving Day, Native Americans and their supporters gather at Coles Hill in Plymouth, overlooking Plymouth Rock, to tell the true story. They remember the genocide. They remember King Philip's war. They remember the centuries of broken treaties, stolen land, and cultural destruction. They remember what Thanksgiving mythology requires Americans to forget. The gathering has continued every year for over 50 years. It's a counter-narrative to the national mythology, a refusal to participate in the forgetting. The organizers of the National Day of Mourning don't necessarily ask Americans to stop celebrating Thanksgiving. They ask Americans to remember honestly. They ask us to acknowledge that the Thanksgiving mythology is a mythology, that it erases genocide, romanticizes colonization, and turns a complex, violent history into a children's story. They ask us to see them as living people, not historical characters, not the generic Indians of Thanksgiving pageants, but real nations with real histories and real ongoing struggles. They ask us to understand that the story didn't end in 1621, that what followed was catastrophic, that the people who saved the Pilgrims were systematically destroyed by the people they saved. And they ask us to consider what it means to celebrate a holiday with this history, not necessarily to stop celebrating, but to do so honestly, with awareness of what we're actually commemorating. Can a holiday survive honest history? This is the question Thanksgiving forces us to ask. If we acknowledge that the Thanksgiving story is largely mythology, if we admit the genocide that followed, if we see the holiday for what it really is, a 19th century invention designed to create national unity through shared myth, can we still celebrate it? I think the answer is yes, but differently. Gratitude is real. The human need to pause, to appreciate what we have, to gather with loved ones. That's genuine. Those needs don't disappear just because the mythology is false. Family connection is real. Whatever the holiday's origins, the fact that it brings people together is valuable. In a country where isolation is epidemic, a holiday that creates gatherings serves a purpose. Even the ritual meal has value. Sharing food, preparing a feast, eating together. These are ancient human practices that create connection and community. But we can do all of these things without lying to ourselves. We can gather, give thanks, share food, connect with family, while also acknowledging the real history. We can be grateful for what we have while remembering how we got it. We can celebrate our blessings while honoring those who were destroyed so we could have them. Honest gratitude might actually be deeper than mythological gratitude. Gratitude that acknowledges its costs, that doesn't require forgetting, that can hold both celebration and mourning at once. That's mature gratitude. That's gratitude worthy of adults. What would a different Thanksgiving look like? Maybe it starts with telling the true story, not to ruin the holiday, but to ground it in reality. Children can understand complexity. They can learn that history is complicated, that people in the past did both good and terrible things, that the stories we tell ourselves are always incomplete. Maybe it includes a moment of acknowledgement, before the meal, before the gratitude, a pause to recognize whose land we're on, to name the native peoples who lived here, to remember what was taken. Maybe it involves supporting native communities. Food drives and charitable giving are part of Thanksgiving tradition. Why not include organizations that support native peoples? Why not make the holiday's charity acknowledge the holiday's history? Maybe it means rethinking the meal itself, not necessarily giving up turkey, but being conscious of what it costs, the lives of the animals, the labor of the workers, the environmental impact of industrial production. Maybe it means resisting the commercial pressure, staying at the table instead of rushing to stores, choosing gratitude over acquisition, letting the day be what it's supposed to be, a pause instead of a prelude to consumption. None of this would destroy Thanksgiving. It would deepen it. It would make the gratitude more real by making it more honest. When you sit down to Thanksgiving dinner, you're sitting at a table with ghosts. The ghosts of the Pilgrims, who survived because native people saved them. The ghost of Squanto, the last of his people, teaching survival skills to the people whose descendants would destroy what remained of his world. The ghosts of the Wampanoag, who made a calculated alliance that ended in genocide. The ghost of Metacom, his head rotting on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. The ghosts of the Pequot, burned alive so Massachusetts could give thanks. The ghost of Sarah Josepha Hale, who spent 36 years constructing the mythology. The ghost of Abraham Lincoln, who created the holiday not for peace but for war. The ghosts of 46 million turkeys, killed so we can perform gratitude. They're all at the table, whether we acknowledge them or not. So this Thanksgiving, before you eat, maybe take a moment, not to feel guilty. Guilt is useless, but to remember, to see clearly, to honor the full weight of what this holiday carries. Give thanks if you want to. Gratitude is real and valuable. But also, remember what the mythology erases. Remember who paid for the feast. Remember that the story didn't end with a shared meal. It ended with genocide. And maybe, in remembering, find a gratitude that's actually honest. Not for a false history, but for this moment, these people, this food, this life, bought at a price we're only beginning to understand. The Pilgrims survived because of native generosity. We celebrate that survival while forgetting what we did in return. Maybe this Thanksgiving, we remember both. Happy Thanksgiving. May your gratitude be honest. May your memory be long. And may the ghosts at your table finally be seen. Thank you for journeying with us through Thanksgiving's hidden history. Thank you for keeping the candle lit. Thank you for remembering what we've forgotten. Until next time.